Hello again for my online classes here in the fall of 2019 for both my full semester and second 8 weeks class. I'm recording this lecture on October the 2nd, and we're looking at political parties, so this is roughly in the middle of the chapters that we'll be covering for our next exam, covering chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. We're a little bit past the middle there, aren't we? Going into chapter 9, looking at political parties. At the beginning of this chapter, like the rest of the chapters, you have a way of describing what is the importance of this topic for American government. And we can see the vital connection that political parties make to American democracy. We have such a large country and so many different, such a diverse population that perhaps we can see the reason there for having political parties. So read through this passage here on page 334 in your text. And what we can also see there is that this is a broader interest than what you may find with a broader amount of support for the groups within a political party than what you might find for interest groups, which is what we'll cover for chapter 11. And they have, as you can see here in this passage, generally a narrow policy objective compared to political parties. And we can see here also that political parties, their role is to win elections. And we'll see that in other aspects of this description of political parties here in chapter 9. Well, our system is a two-party system. Most democracies around the world would have more than two competitive political parties. But for the most part, in our voting system and our campaigns, it's really two political parties. The Democratic Party, as we see described with the donkey there on your left, and the Republican Party with the elephant as its mascot on the right. So those two parties have been the main competitors since really the 1850s. So for a good portion of our history, we've always had a two-party system, as we'll describe here, throughout the periods of American government, and we've had these two political parties competing since the 1850s. So a political scientist that was very well known, especially in the 1950s, E.E. Schatzsnyder, was a firm believer in political parties, and again, coming back to the structure of the United States and the complexity of the United States, could not have democracy without political parties. So this is a really well-known quote by Professor Schatzsnyder. So again, political parties organize groups that attempt to influence the government by electing their members to important government offices. And what we have here is a picture of all the, at one time, Democratic candidates for president. And we've seen that this has been narrowed down already. In fact, as I look this over, just to kind of point out to you, look at the top row, starting with your left, and you can go, just kind of go over to the side here. You have Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Cory Booker, and Senator Amy Klobuchar. Those individuals are still in the race, so that's 5. Then you have on the second row, you have former Representative Beto O'Rourke and a U.S. Representative Tulsi Gabbard, both on the immediate left here, and your left again, and they are still in the race. Then you go to the right on this picture, and the last two on that side, you have Juan Castro, former cabinet official, and the former Vice President Joe Biden. They're still in there, so that's at 9 people. And then you go to the bottom row here, and on the extreme left of this group of pictures, you have Pete Buttigieg, who is a mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and still in the race. So that would put us at 10. Then you have Andrew Yang, roughly in the middle of this row of pictures, an entrepreneur from California. He's in the race, so that's 10. And that's pretty much from this group of pictures, the people that we have there. So we've seen a considerable narrowing that's occurred, and might have missed someone along the way, but I think that's pretty much everyone. But in a way, that's the process. That's how you make a determination of who should win the nomination of your party. People run for office, and they have to raise money, and they participate in debates and participate in campaigns. And public opinion polls give us an idea of how much support they're receiving. And then the party itself makes determinations on how many people can continue to participate in the debates as the months go on. And so we're seeing a situation where more people are still able to be part of the debates, but many other people are finding it harder and harder to qualify. And that becomes part of the process that we see occurring for political parties, part of the role of political parties. Now, one of the things that we are clearly seeing, if you've been following the news recently, as I'm recording this again on October the 2nd, we can see the impact of having a divided government. So we've never had a president that's been impeached in our system of government, and that means that they're setting up a trial to determine whether or not that individual should remain as president. And impeached means there's a vote held in the House of Representatives to have that individual now sit up for the trial. But that's never occurred where one party controls both Congress and the president. So as we have in our system right now, we have a majority Democrat party having the number of votes in the House, and we have a Republican president. So when we look through, 3 other presidents were either impeached or threatened to be impeached to the point where the individual resigned. And so you had impeached Andrew Johnson in the 1860s, Democrat with a Republican majority in Congress. Bill Clinton impeached in the 1990s, Democrat with a Republican majority in Congress. And then you had in the 1970s, Richard Nixon, Republican, where he was threatened to be impeached and then went on to resign, and there was a majority Democrat held House and Senate. So the votes were there in both the House and the Senate. More than likely, the votes were there in the Senate. That would have involved other Republicans to vote to remove Richard Nixon, and that's where it began the process of him stepping down, knowing that the votes would not have been there. But in all 3 cases, there was divided government. And so we're seeing divided government right now, which clearly is part of the ingredients needed, at least in our history here, of having a president impeached and possibly having the president removed. But political parties can make a difference, and obviously they need to make a difference. If you're living in a system of government that's pretty repressive and you have very little limited choice and maybe limited amounts of expression, we can see that political parties are going to be controlled. So, for example, when there was a overthrow of the government in Thailand, for example, that's where this picture is taking place, the military took control of the government, and elections were null and void. You had a case there where the military also then detained party leaders and put different leaders of political parties in prison, as the army now would run the government. So when you start to see repressive systems, almost always what would happen is that the political parties would also start to be limited and perhaps abolished. The case here in Nazi Germany, 1933, as you can see, the specific date, political parties were outlawed. So if you're considering whether or not opposition parties really matter, consider what happens in, again, repressive regimes, dictatorial systems. You have then a case in which there is no opposing voice. No opposing voice is allowed. And so I think that that's, by the very actions of these types of governments and political parties, we can see the need to have opposition parties. But to be more specific, here are some of the things that we can see that political parties do. They recruit candidates, they nominate candidates, they mobilize voters, they contest elections, they provide accountability, and they provide social services. That last bullet point is not really an area that's used by political parties today. So that should read not used. Sorry about that. But just make that note to yourself that we don't really see political parties providing social services. Let's go into more detail about what the political parties do. So recruiting candidates, just stop and think to yourself how difficult this might be in some parts of the country where one party is clearly dominant. Now you're trying to get an opposition voice. And so if one area of the country, let's say you have a U.S. senator, and that U.S. senator, perhaps he himself has won 4 straight elections, or maybe one political party representing that state in the U.S. Senate has won 5 or 6 straight elections. That's going on now to something like 30 years. Well, the other party may have a very difficult time recruiting a candidate, recruiting a very successful candidate, one that has name recognition, is able to raise money, a good communicator. That it's just increasingly going to be harder to do. And so the political parties need to work at that, work at trying to recruit somebody, just like recruiting people to join a team or recruiting people to be part of a business. It can certainly be harder if there's an indication that success is not readily available. But that's, again, the importance of political parties to try to do that. They also nominate candidates. We were just looking at that when we looked at the presidential system here in the year 2019, going into the primaries that will start in early 2020. So the idea of how these candidates are going to be nominated, how they go through the process to pick one candidate over all the other ones who are running. And so there are different systems that are used in this nomination process. For example, some states would have a caucus, and this is more demanding than other systems of voting. So if you note here, you have to show up at a set time at a caucus. So maybe it's 7 o'clock at night. You have to be at a school or a gymnasium or a civic center. And then the people in that particular district who are registered voters who can participate, they have to announce publicly which candidate that they would support. So that might mean they have to raise their hand or stand up in a certain portion of the room, something like that. But there is some show publicly of support. That's the caucus system. Most states would have a primary system, and most of those states would have the closed primary. But there is an open, closed, and there's even some variations beyond these two. But the open, registered voters can participate, and perhaps it might even mean people registered in the other political party can actually cross over and vote. And you have the closed primary where only registered party members can participate. And we have a variety of these two in the state of Oklahoma. So this is one of the ways of looking at the calendar of going through the nomination process. A lot of people are looking this over now for the year 2020. So this is last presidential primary system here, the calendar. But you can see that some states are clearly very important because they're in this process early on, and candidates then need to go to these states and get that attention. So Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada are the ones that are getting the most attention, especially Iowa and New Hampshire. And this will be slightly different perhaps in the order based in 2020. But you can see here that if you lose early on, it's going to be tough to catch up, and so that's why these early states become so important. Oklahoma, roughly in the early part of March, will be when the primary will be held in this state. Now, there's a lot of verbiage on this chart here, but you can kind of pause and look it over. But the key part to look at the difference here is that the Republican Party in many of its states will have a winner-take-all system. And that's interesting because that can mean you could have a very competitive election among candidates, but if one candidate got just a few percentage points more than the other candidates, that candidate would win the state. So let's say you had three candidates. One candidate got 35% of the vote, one candidate got 32% of the vote, one candidate got 30% of the vote. That's pretty competitive. But the candidate that got 35% of the vote would get all the delegates in a winner-take-all system, as it sounds. That's just literally what happens. So that's where you can really see a separation faster among the candidates if you have that winner-take-all system. Democrats have a proportional system, so consistently that means that a candidate can hang around and finish third and second or fourth in some states and still pick up some delegates and still be competitive. So we saw some difference there in 2016. The party with the winner-take-all system, Trump was able to, in the Republican Party, wrap it up by May 3rd. But the party that had the proportional system, Clinton was not able to wrap it up until a month after that. And generally, that's exactly what happens. The system of proportional representation tends to help candidates that are not winning outright. It gives them ability to continue to hang in there. And so for the state of Oklahoma, we can see that there'll be and this continues to be our system, a closed primary for Republicans, so only registered Republicans can vote in the Republican primary. But for Democrats, it's semi-open, meaning that registered Democrats can vote in the primary, but so can registered independents. And so that's the difference that we have in the state of Oklahoma. And it will be roughly that same date. I would think that it will probably be in 2020, say March the 2nd, somewhere like that. Don't have a calendar right in front of me, but roughly the same time. So also then the two parties mobilize voters, and this becomes a very important task. And one of the key ways to get people to vote is to personally ask them to vote. This is always, through studies, the most effective way to get people to participate, by personally asking them, will you vote? They're more likely to vote if someone has personally asked them. So you can spend all that money on advertisements, get on the web, but what attracts people is that personal contact. And so that's why having these volunteers and going door to door can be so important. Political parties also contest elections. So this is something that can only happen if you have at least two candidates on the ballot. You can't contest an election if there's only one person on the ballot. And so we can see that in the elections that we have. Many of our elections, we have the bare minimum there. We have only two candidates on the ballot, but at least you have to have those two for it to be a contested election. And you also have to have a system that allows both candidates an opportunity to truly win. So that's how this political parties can make sure that the system is legitimate. If it's allowed to give candidates a chance to compete, to campaign, and get their message out. But in dictatorships, there may be elections, but they're not legitimate. So in Cuba for many years, when Fidel Castro was the dictator of that island country, they never specifically called him a dictator, but he would operate that way, one person really in charge. It was a case in which there was no competition among political parties. There were no one else on the ballot, or if someone else was on the ballot, there was no real chance for that other person to win. So a dictatorship, you just don't have contested elections. And we can see here also the importance of providing accountability. So if you had one political party in charge, then you can really signal in or focus in on which political party you give the credit to and which party you give the criticism to. If you like the way things are going or you don't like the way things are going. But if you have a divided government, then it perhaps becomes more complicated to make the decision on where you place the blame or the credit. And so we certainly have had times of divided government in recent years, as you can see here from this slide. Providing social services, again, not really the system that we have today. Perhaps one of the last places where you saw this boss system, as it was called, the machine, where you would have a party that would operate based on series of understandings among people and would certainly be a corrupt system by most people's estimations. You had Mayor Richard Daley, you can see that picture there on the left, of the city of Chicago, which was operating by the Daley machine, which would have been a segment within the Democratic Party. And people would work their way up through that machine to get certain jobs, and that's how the decisions would be made on how government would operate within the Daley machine in the city of Chicago. City of New York operated that way for many years, and it's described in a fantastic film, Gangs of New York, and you're looking at the whole process of developing a bureaucracy, developing a city government within the confines of party control, and it shows there the boss system. It's kind of a segment of the film overall, but it is an interesting part that's brought out, and it's worth watching if you haven't watched that film, and pay attention there to the development of a political party and its ways of running the government of New York City. There are third political parties, so most of what you see in this chapter deals with the two-party system, but there are other political parties, and there are attempts for these political parties to be successful. So one of the better-known third parties is the Green Party. It was available on the ballot in most states, and I'm sure that it will be on the ballot in most states in 2020. Was not on the ballot in Oklahoma, but I would believe it gets on the ballot in about 45 of the 50 states, and perhaps even more than that. So it's a competitive third party to some degree. Competitive of the third parties is the Libertarian Party, and you see some description of these two political parties in your text. The Green Party, like the name suggests, in some ways you can see the implication there, is a environmental party and tries to make decisions on its policies that would focus on the environment and trying to improve the environment. Libertarian Party, again, suggests from the name of the party, is focusing on the liberty and freedom for the individual, and ways of limiting government authority over the individual. And this was the candidate for the Libertarian Party in the year 2016, Gary Johnson. Dr. Jill Stein, that you saw in the picture for the Green Party, was the candidate for president for the Green Party in 2016. Well, we have third parties, but we just don't have very successful third parties. And so it's worth describing or exploring ideas as to why third parties are not successful. And so here's some of the reasons for that. They're too dependent on a single leader. What happens to that one leader when that individual gets out of politics? Just tends to mean that political party starts to die out. You'll see there in your text some description of some of the better known third parties. Once, for example, Teddy Roosevelt got out of politics, the Bull Moose Party just really fell apart. Ross Perot's political party in the early 1990s Once he got out of politics, that party fell apart. Ross Perot passed away, I believe, just last year, but he was one of the more successful third-party leaders in American history. Got close to 20% of the vote, as was also former President Teddy Roosevelt when he ran in 1912 as the candidate for the Bull Moose Party. But they can also be too regional. Maybe they're well known in some parts of the country and perhaps non-existent in other places. This is a cartoon showing the Populist Party, which was against the gold standard and wanted to expand the backing of paper currency to include both silver and gold to help more paper currency get into the system and help more people advance economically. At least that was their argument. Well, they were very popular in the South and in the West, but since a lot of powerful economic systems and banking systems were found in the Northeast of the United States, they weren't very well known there. In fact, again, almost non-existent, not real popular or well known in the West or upper Midwest of the country as well. And so they just didn't have much overall national success. Perhaps there are a few issues that they really focus on. This makes them more like an interest group. When they do this, have a narrow interest, narrow objective. And so during Prohibition, for example, there was a light wine and beer party. So their argument was if you wanted to continue to ban hard liquor, whiskey and gin, okay, but how about allow people to have light wine and beer? Might be an important issue, might attract some people, but was it an important issue to get people to just vote for that party? Not really, and so they weren't very successful. And they may just simply be too radical. They're wanting an overall change of the system where most people may say, we want to make some changes to the system, but we don't want to overall change the system. We don't want to, perhaps we want to see some tax increases or tax decreases, but we don't want to get rid of private property, as the communists may argue. Maybe we're not real fond of affirmative action, but the idea that one group of people will become less second-class citizens, which the National Socialists may be arguing for, that's not something that most people are going to support. And so there we can see some of the resistance to these radical political parties. But I should point out, if you would like to venture online and do the research, these types of political parties do exist in the United States. There is a Nazi party and there is a Communist Party. So they are in existence there. But they generally, and I think this is a good thing, don't get a lot of support in the United States. But perhaps a big reason why they're just not very successful third parties is the voting system. Single district, simple plurality, which is really winner take all. And so in that case, there's just not much of an opportunity to get some representation if you lose outright, no matter how close you may be. And so in that system, one winner per district, and the winner does not need a majority. We oftentimes may say that, but that's not necessary. They just need more votes than anybody else. And this is where you then see this outcome that's connected to Duvernay's law and why there's only two competitive political parties. If you have a single district, simple plurality system, that's what will be produced. According to Duvernay's law, it's not something that's binding, but just seems to be a consistent outcome. Well, here we can see some political party, some court cases that deal with political parties and ways in which we can then see that political parties have changed over time through the law. So we don't, for example, anyone can join a political party and it's not a private club. There was attempts for this to be the case in trying to maintain Jim Crow system and segregation, especially in the South with the Democratic Party at the time, and that has now changed through court cases that you can't have people joining a political party based on race identity. It is worth noting, if you look over this chapter, that clearly the Democratic Party of the 1940s is not the Democratic Party of today. If that was the case, then you certainly wouldn't have had Barack Obama running as a Democrat. You wouldn't have today Kamala Harris running as a Democrat. Some of the people that I just mentioned who are running, Andrew Yang as a Democrat in that case. But that certainly was the case in the 1940s, and worth noting on that. You can also see here that you can't then have a situation where people get a benefit by being a member of one political party over the other when they're applying for a state job. And that was in the case of Rutan versus Republican Party of Illinois, 1990. So when we look at the issue of proportional representation, is this a good outcome? Is this a different type of system that we can use here? And perhaps we'd get more political parties if we went this way. There are many countries in the world that do use proportional representation. So here you can read about how votes are determined and representation is determined through the election by using proportional representation. And this is a recent outcome. They've actually had an election since then, but in Germany, that uses proportional representation. And right off, you get more political parties. Now, you have to have a certain kind of threshold. If you have that threshold, in other words, you have to attain a certain percentage of the vote in order to get representation. So if you have the threshold at like 5%, then you can be a successful political party to some degree, getting some representation by not getting a whole lot of votes. But if you raise that threshold up into the 30s, then you really start to limit the number of political parties that are competing. And so Angela Merkel, that will probably be getting out of politics soon in Germany, she's a member of the Christian Democrats, the party that has been able to get the most votes, but not a majority. So what she's had to do to maintain her chancellorship in Germany is to work with other political parties to maintain a coalition. And so that's one of the things that you see that has to happen with proportional representation. And generally, that you're going to have more than two political parties. And this is the voting system that we can see there, that there's usually a combination of both the proportional system and the first past the post or winner take all system when you're picking a candidate. And that's pretty much where we're going to be here. I think we're pretty much near the end of the presentation. So we'll be moving our attention to campaigns and elections with Chapter 10, the last of our chapters, for our next test. One other thing here to say then is just the exaggeration that we can see from what happens in our system. That a lot of times you get more representation in the two-party system, even though you don't get that much of the votes. So notice here, in a recent election, Republicans got 47% of the vote, but they got 54% of the representation. And so usually the single district simple plurality system can exaggerate the outcome of the votes. And so one of the reasons why there's been an argument to go to a proportional system and a multi-party system. It would have its own complications and problems, but could perhaps increase voter turnout and give people a more connected voice to what they're truly seeking in a campaign. Not that we're going to go to that direction anytime soon, but perhaps the two-party system and the first past the post system creates some problems and why we have this disenchantment with political parties today. And this is the last of our slides, is to think about perhaps are we seeing an end to the contemporary party system, which has been a system of volatility where you have not had one consistent political party dominating the system. And perhaps going into 2020, we will start to finally see that. But 2018 brought us, again, a divided government. So we've had periods of divided government pretty consistently throughout this last party system. All right, we'll be moving on to campaigns and elections.